So I want to talk today about Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition Rules as Written or Raw. Now, there's a lot of talk about AD&D Raw on the internet. And people's interpretation of AD&D Raw, I think, varies depending on who you're talking to. And by the way, I apologize for the eye. I've been having some serious sleep issues lately. However, I think I found the cure. And that was having a large man come and bash my face in with a hammer until I passed out. So I don't know how sustainable that is. But anyways, AD&D Raw to me is the recognition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition as an entirely different game than other versions of D&D. Now, I mean, that's evidenced in the name itself, I think. But AD&D 1E sort of gets mixed in as like just another iteration or another version of D&D, when really, if you sit and read the rules properly and you analyze the Dungeon Master's Guide and you start implementing with and playing with a lot of the suggestions or ideas in there that a lot of other people will take for granted, you realize quickly that AD&D 1E is totally distinct from BX, from Holmes Basic, from even the second edition of AD&D and the other versions of D&D going forward. It is really a uniquely different experience because it emphasizes large-scale campaign play. It emphasizes the map, the world map, the game setting, the campaign setting as the focus entity of the game, rather than taking, your 4 or 5 or 6 PCs and sort of wrapping a story around them. They're just being thrust into this world, and this world is active, whether or not they're engaged with it, when they're engaged with it, and that there's maybe an expectation that you would have multiple parties comprised of multiple players all taking part in this collective campaign world, influencing one another in the process, maybe interfering with one another in the process, and having that be the center focus so that the campaign goes on long after those characters are dead. The campaign goes on long after those players have maybe moved on and they have been replaced by other players. So there's this sort of misconception, I think, that AD&D Raw means a complete and stringent emphasis on following the rules as written to the point where it hinders the game if you don't know something. And I don't know who plays any role-playing game like that, because that is a tremendous detriment on the player experience. If you have to open a rule book because you can't remember something and you have to sit there for 20 minutes poking through the book to find it, and you maybe have to do that 3, 4, 5 times a session, I guarantee people aren't going to be coming back for those sessions. So when I think of rules as written, I don't look at it as, if I don't know something, I've got to find it out and we got to do it by the books, etc. I look at it as more of a commitment to the structure that was put in place by Gary Gygax when he wrote AD&D. There are a lot of detractors of this because there's a lot of people that say, well, Gary never played this way. Gary made these rules, but he ended up doing something different in the end. And while I actually am not against those assertions, especially when some of them come from people that were very close to Gary and they were good friends with him and they played in his games, I think that it's too often used as a way to discredit AD&D, to say that, well, it's fundamentally worthless because Gary later decided that he wasn't going to run his games using it. So if Gary didn't do it, then AD&D is discredited. But I think the thing to remember here is that Gary wrote, just for the core books alone, over 900 pages of material, carefully thought out and constructed material, sometimes not conveyed in a super user-friendly way, and sometimes open-ended, to where you would look at something as more of a suggestion than a rule. I think miniature scaling is one key component that I pointed out in my reading of the Dungeon Master's Guide, where it's very clear that Gary is making assumptions about what you might be using, but that he's also offering you alternatives for what you could be using as far as miniature scaling goes, right? So nowadays we look at 28 millimeter and 32 millimeter as sort of standard miniature sizes, but that wasn't the same back then. And there are 15 millimeter figures, and there are 10 millimeter figures. There's all kinds of different scales of miniatures, and Gary gave you a framework to figure out how you were going to perform these sort of tactical elements of the game using different scales. So there are suggestions in AD&D as well, and you need to be careful to define what those are. And if you want to try to stick to the core game and play rules as written, and why would you do that in the first place? I think that the best reason to run AD&D rules as written is because you do get a fundamentally different game out of it than you do just about any other game I can think of. The only thing I can think of in modern times that even comes close to AD&D would be Adventure Conqueror King Revised, where that campaign world really is the focus, and it's a living kind of breathing thing. And this is where 1-1 time comes in. 1-1 time and Raw, there's people that like to pick them apart. And a lot of the time I feel like that happens because they haven't actually run those ideas for any significant amount of time to see where the benefits and the flaws lie. And yes, there are benefits and flaws to these things, as there are anything. And you need to learn to navigate them. But if you make a concerted effort to really read and understand and play out these different ideas, you can have an experience that is so far removed and so different from what we would consider conventional play. And when I say conventional, I mean you have a set group of players. Those players each have one player character, and you are forming an adventure around those characters for them to explore. So it's a very different idea, whereas AD&D maps out to something maybe more like a grand strategy game if you include all of its elements. And if you get to a higher level of play where factions and strongholds are involved, and then other ideas that people are talking about a lot, such as the Braunstein mode of play. If you can get a game going where you integrate all of these things, and that also includes solo play, because there are solo play rules in AD&D, and they are not there as a separate entity. I do really believe that solo play is meant to be part of an existing campaign world to flesh out certain chunks of the world, so that players can really be active and engaged in building out the world for everybody to take part in. But you will get a different game altogether than anything else that was sort of published in that general succession of games. There are arguments too for that, BX and Chainmail / OD&D do some of these things, but AD&D was really like the culmination of a lot of these ideas and packaging it in an extremely complete fashion. But it takes a lot of work, and my honest admission of how I run my games is that I'm still learning a lot of these core concepts as well and how to properly integrate them all together. But I am very careful not to let these things bog down the game. So I don't really do house rules. There's a couple of little concessions or changes I make. For example, one of the elements of AD&D combat is finding out if you hit someone in the head or not. I like to use a die for that. That's specifically like a body hit die. It's got like body, legs, arms, head. These are really small adjustments that change the math in very slight ways. But they're not a major departure from what's already there. They're more of a convenience factor, or even just a way to add some flair to the game when I'm rolling those dice at the table in front of people, and they can very clearly see the result without having to calculate anything else. But I will not let the game get bogged down if I don't know something. So I do make calls sometimes where it boils down to, hey, roll target number 14 on this die because we need to move through this quickly. We just need to figure out, there's some element of randomness here, and we need to determine if it's a yes or a no. It's like consulting a magic 8-ball in a sense, but with more of a variance in math so that it's not just a 50-50. And you can keep the game moving. I think that the important thing for any game is that you always keep it moving and you keep it fluid. I wrote a blog recently where I talked about flow state and the zone in video games. Specifically talking about arcade games or like sort of twitch, fast, reflex oriented games or games like Tetris where you are kind of moving out of consciousness when you play, in a sense, where everything starts to feel so natural that you don't even think about the controller anymore. You don't really even think about the inputs. And your brain almost starts to wander because you're just so engaged. And it's such muscle memory at that point that you can play effectively while you're thinking about other things. Now, I'll have a link to that below if anybody's interested in that. I don't know how adjacent video games are to most RPG gamers, but I would imagine most of you guys also play video games. But AD&D, it doesn't have those elements. It doesn't have fast reflex. It doesn't have time in terms of you have 15 seconds, go. I do that sometimes. If a player is dragging their ass for too long, I'll say, okay, you have 15 seconds to decide what you're doing, or you don't do anything this turn. But that is not like a real element of the game. That's just something I do out of impatience and to encourage people to make decisions more quickly, and it's pretty rarely employed. But I do think AD&D and D&D in general has its own sort of flow state. And to me, that's when the DM is able to push things along, to make quick decisions and improvisations when the plan has fallen apart or failed. I'm not much of a prep guy, and I never have been. I do tend to think off the cuff quite a bit. And I will say that I would not recommend people go down that path to begin with. I would recommend you start with maybe some pre-constructed ideas and build up from there into more improvisation, because it's going to come up whether you want it to or not. You can never fully prep anything. However, I think that where it's hurt me is that I rely almost too much on thinking on my feet, and I don't prep enough sometimes. It generally does not hurt the sessions. However, there are times when I feel like I could have fleshed out an idea more, or I could have extrapolated on something more. And I'm getting better at that, especially as I get more into AD&D and faction play, where I'm always thinking about what factions are moving around the map, how that's affecting things, etc. So that's my prep. My prep isn't really story or lore or history. And some players have minor issues with that, but it doesn't affect the game overall. So it's not something I focus on. But I do have improvements to do. I think like anybody would probably be able to admit that they do in their games. And sticking with the idea of raw and going back to that, it's having that framework there to guide you and to push you in that direction. And it does require discipline, and it requires time, and it requires learning. But you have a more cohesive game experience when you do it. Because when you start fudging too many things haphazardly, and you don't know enough, that's when you start to run into problems. And that's when things really start to break down. So, to me, the idea of AD&D Raw, or rules as written games in general, is these games were constructed with intention. They were typically play tested. A lot of the problems that could have come up were already addressed by the playtesters and by the writers of the game. So if you take the real basic skeleton and throw the rest out, you're going to have an experience, I think, a lot of the time where you're going to run into these foibles that have already been addressed for you. So it's kind of like reinventing the wheel in a sense. And then you also, with AD&D especially, if you just focus on the character creation and the stuff in the player's handbook, and you just refer to the Dungeon Master's Guide for combat tables and the monster manual, you're missing out on this entire other experience. This major departure from BX and from 5th edition and these other games that are so much more focused on just the PCs as they exist in the world. And I don't think that focus is bad, but I think that the experience that AD&D provides, if you stick to it really closely, as close as you can, is one that provides a campaign that has sort of a limitless longevity. Like, I don't plan to start another campaign. I don't plan to go out and make another world map or buy another campaign setting or anything like that, because I can already see that I have more than enough here to sustain this game as long as I want. I've told my players sort of half jokingly, this campaign will run till I'm dead, and then when I die, one of you guys can pick it up and keep going with it. And that's why I get them so engaged in the world building aspect of it, and I allow for solo play to happen inside the same campaign, and that there are now multiple groups that are forming. I've got my main sort of primary group I started with that has grown to a point where it's not sustainable to keep adding people to that group, so I'm starting an entire second group, and then I'm starting an NPC group that my daughter and I are going to be running sort of in parallel solo with each other that will also have an impact on that world. And the idea is that eventually there'll be several groups moving around on this map, influencing it, and that players will also have several characters for downtime when something is happening and their character's not available for play due to the 1-1 time, that they'll be able to pick up another party and carry on with that. And that this can go on in perpetuity. There's no real reason to change it or to stop it unless something cataclysmic in the world happens where the world ceases to exist. But that's like Hollywood movie stuff, and I'm just not interested in that kind of, well, let's send a Tarrasque out there to start blowing everything up, kind of cop-out plot device. It doesn't make sense for the kind of game that I'm running at this point. So it really is all about these smaller conflicts that grow into larger conflicts, that grow into alliances and diplomacy and all these other elements. And AD&D has such support for this and such a backbone of this in its DNA that's why I think it's worth playing rules as written, and that is why I think it is just a completely different game than any other version of Dungeons and Dragons. Is it better? Is it worse? I guess that depends on the type of game that you run. Like, I have friends that are more story gamers, and they do want to run more conventional games, and their players are fine with that, and they have long-running campaigns. For me, I'm more of a I'm right in the middle between war gamer and a role playing gamer, I guess. To the point where the projects that I like to work on sort of converge those things together as well. So this is sort of my case or my explanation for how I feel about AD&D rules as written. I'm not speaking for anybody here. I do talk to, and obviously I'm engaged with the Bro SR. I almost said the Bro OSR, which some people will understand that reference. But I only speak for myself, and I still feel like I'm obviously an individual that's going to have a variance in the way that I look at these things. So if it doesn't line up with some of the things those guys talk about, well, tough shit, I guess. But there it is. So I haven't done a video for a while. I wanted to do one. I will try to keep making these things as time goes on, but it all just depends on what else is going on in my life. I am going on Dunder Moose's podcast or stream tomorrow, and we're going to be shooting the shit, talking about things. My sort of co-director at Mycelium Games and I are going to start streaming, but we're going to kind of do that in a more casual way. That's going to be more focused on that sort of in the room with somebody humor as we're playing games. The first video I really want to do with him is showing off what we've built for Procyon Frequency, because it's come quite a long way, even since more recent footage that I've shown. And so we just want to sit down and jam that out for an hour and then just goof around while we're doing it. I was also on Nerd Cognito on the weekend, and that video should be coming out soon. It's sort of naturally outdated since we were doing this sort of dramatic work on X to play up my departure from the Bro SR and how I made a triumphant return to kind of show these guys up that are writing essays in a contest, so I have that to do. And I'm also reviewing a couple of books. I'm looking into Hell March by Alchemic Raker. It is a mass combat system for Shadow Dark. It's really cool so far, really straightforward, and so I'm going to try and get on top of that as soon as I can. And then White Box by The Basic Expert is the other one. Adventure Conqueror King Revised is still on my radar. That is still something I want to eventually write about or make a video about, but that is just such a massive behemoth of a game. I have not had time for it. And then other than that, I'm still working on my tabletop RPG wargaming hybrid Cosmic Debris, so I'll be talking about that more as we go on. Anyways, guys, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Take care.